Silence. Then, a faint hospital monitor, its steady beep, beep, breaking the stillness. A child's soft laugh flickers through the quiet, only to stop as if cut by an unseen hand. She knew she wouldn't see another summer. Not the ocean, not her school, not even her own room. But there was one thing, one last thing. She wanted to see him, just once more. And when the doctors shook their heads, her father said only this: "I'll find him." Late 1976, Jackson, Tennessee. Elvis Presley, fresh from Las Vegas shows, was preparing for Memphis performances. But under the watchful grip of his manager, reaching him was almost impossible. In a small bedroom across the state, 14-year-old Annie, already bound to her bed, studied a worn poster from a 1972 concert, the night she'd seen him in person for the first time. The colors were fading, the paper creased, but in her eyes, the memory burned bright. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The wind had picked up outside, hurling dry leaves across the front porch and rattling the loose pane in the kitchen window. Inside, the little house was wrapped in that dim amber light only a single bulb can give, a stubborn glow from the cracked fixture above the table. The smell of boiled potatoes still clung to the air from supper, mixing with a faint trace of cold tobacco drifting from the man's coat as he stepped through the back door. He closed it gently, almost as though noise itself might break the quiet. His hands, raw from a 12-hour shift under a stubborn Dodge engine, were still dotted with black smudges. The weight of his tool belt pulled at his shoulder. He set it down by the stove with a dull thud. In the corner, near the refrigerator, sat his daughter. Annie was 12, but looked younger in that moment, knees drawn up on the chair, chin resting on them. A faded poster of Elvis Presley lay across her lap, its edges curled from years of being taped and untaped on her bedroom wall. The ink had begun to fade where her fingertips had traced the outline of his face too many times. She didn't look up when her father entered. He hung his cap on the hook, poured hot water from the kettle into 2 mugs, and dropped a tea bag into each. The sound of it, quiet but certain, seemed to stir her from wherever her thoughts had been hiding. She glanced up at him, her eyes red around the edges, though she wasn't crying now. Her voice came out smaller than he'd heard it in years. "Daddy," she said, "I'm never going to see him again." "Am I?" He didn't answer right away. He slid one of the mugs across the table toward her, the porcelain warm against her hands. Steam curled up between them, carrying the sharp scent of black tea. For a long moment, all he could hear was the low hum of the old refrigerator and the occasional pop from the bulb overhead. She turned the poster over, revealing the back where she had once scribbled song titles in pencil. With her thumb, she spun a cassette tape on the table, one of those cheap plastic ones you had to press the lid down on twice to make sure it stayed closed. The label was peeling, but in her small handwriting you could still read, "Love Me Tender." He sat down opposite her, leaning forward until his forearms rested on the table. His voice, when it came, was even, steady in a way that made her stop fidgeting. "You don't know your old man yet, Annie." She blinked at him, unsure what he meant. "I'm gonna find him," he said. "Elvis. And he's gonna come to you." The words hung there between them, heavier than the creak of the wind outside or the hiss of steam escaping the kettle. Annie stared at him like she was trying to decide if this was one of those comforting lies parents tell without meaning to keep. But something in his tone, solid, almost like he'd already made a pact with someone, made her straighten up in her chair. He sipped his tea and didn't break her gaze. "You just let me do the worrying. You keep that poster close." She swallowed, her fingers tightening around the paper as though it might crumble. "But How? He leaned back, his chair groaning under him. You remember when I told you about that old army buddy of mine, Charlie Sanders? She nodded slowly. She'd heard the name in passing before, usually in stories about long-ago nights in barracks and the endless heat of some base they'd both been stationed at. Well, he went on, Charlie ended up playing with a band for a while. And one of those boys went on to work the road with Elvis himself. Plays guitar for him. Still does, far as I know. He paused, tapping the side of his mug. That's a door. Maybe not a big one, but it's there. I just gotta figure out how to knock without getting it slammed in my face. Annie shifted, setting the cassette down gently, as though she was afraid any sudden movement might scatter this fragile plan into the cold air. Outside, the wind had settled into a low moan through the trees. Her father reached over, brushing a bit of hair away from her forehead. His fingers were rough, the nails still rimmed with oil he hadn't been able to scrub away. I can't promise how quick it'll be, but I'm not letting you lose hope before Christmas. That was when the light above them flickered again, making the kitchen walls seem to breathe for a heartbeat before settling back into their amber haze. He stood, pulling his coat from the chair and patting the pocket where a pack of cigarettes rattled softly. Annie watched him as he crossed to the back door. She knew he wasn't the sort to talk big without meaning it. But this was different. This was her father claiming something against the odds, in the same voice he might use to swear an oath. He opened the door, and the cold bit into the warmth of the kitchen, carrying with it the distant sound of a neighbor's radio, some crackling country tune. Before stepping out, he glanced back at her. You keep that tape ready, he said. Might be you'll need to play it for him yourself. Then he was gone into the night, boots thudding on the porch boards, leaving the kitchen steeped in steam and the faint scent of tobacco. Annie sat there a long while, the poster pressed to her chest, feeling the weight of a promise that was somehow both impossible and entirely real. The payphone outside the garage always smelled faintly of gasoline, its black receiver slick with the touch of too many hands. By the time he stood there on Thursday morning, a quarter clenched between his fingers, frost had crept across the glass panel beside him. He fed the coin into the slot and dialed a number he hadn't used in over a decade. The ring on the other end sounded distant, thin. When a voice finally came through, low, hoarse with sleep, it took him a moment to match it to the memory. Charlie? It's me. Tom A. pause, then a laugh that carried a trace of surprise. I'll be damned. Thought you'd dropped off the map. Yeah, well, I need to see you. It's about something important. You in Nashville these days? That was how, 3 days later, Tom found himself steering his old truck down the long stretch of Highway 70, the sky flat and colorless overhead. Nashville announced itself with the smell of wet asphalt and the distant wail of a siren somewhere beyond the skyline. Charlie had chosen the meeting place, one of those low-roof diners clinging to the shoulder of the road, the kind with a neon sign buzzing even in daylight. Inside, the floor gave a tired groan under each step. Booths sagged in the middle from years of coffee drinkers leaning across them. Charlie was already there, a half-empty mug before him, his hair more silver than Tom remembered. They shook hands, both men gripping a little longer than necessary, as if to take stock of who they'd become. After a few pleasantries, Tom laid it out. Not the whole thing. He didn't mention hospital rooms or Christmas deadlines, but enough for Charlie to lean back in the booth and whistle under his breath. You're right. I still know Ronnie. He's been with Elvis's band for years. Good man. But it's not simple anymore. Back in '70, sure. I could have just walked you in after a show. But since '74, there's a whole new crew running the gate. Big guys, mean ones. Even if Ronnie wanted to help, he'd have to get past them first. And the colonel. He stopped himself, glancing toward the counter where the waitress was pouring coffee for a trucker. Let's just say the colonel don't like surprises. Anyone tries to get to Elvis without going through him, it doesn't end well. Tom felt the words settle on him like damp weight. He'd driven 200 miles for this sliver of connection, and now it felt like a door closing in slow motion. They sat in silence for a moment, the clock over the counter ticking too loudly. Then the bell above the entrance gave a sharp jingle, and a man in a black overcoat stepped inside. He was tall, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He moved toward the back, but halfway there he slowed, his gaze catching on their booth. "You fellas talking about Graceland?" The question came without warmth, but not with hostility either. Tom glanced at Charlie, whose brow had furrowed. "And if we are?" Charlie asked. The man pulled out the chair opposite Tom and sat without asking. Up close, his coat smelled faintly of rain and stale cigarette smoke. "I know someone," he said. "Not a guard, not staff, but someone who works the kitchen over there. Gets in and out without much notice. Could maybe get something into the house?" Tom's heart thumped once, hard. "A letter," he said. "That's all I need. Just a letter. Maybe a photograph." The man nodded slowly. "Could be done. But you need to understand. If the colonel finds out it didn't come through him, it'll get ugly. Not just for you, for anyone who touched it. He's particular about the chain of contact." Charlie shifted uneasily in his seat. "He's right, Tom. You're stepping into something you can't control once it's moving." But Tom barely heard him. He was looking at the man in the coat, measuring the truth in his eyes. This stranger had appeared out of nowhere, and yet his words felt like the first crack in the wall Charlie had just described. "Leave a number," the man said, sliding a paper napkin toward Tom. "I'll find you if it's possible. Don't come looking for me." And then he was gone. The bell over the door jingling again as a rush of cold air followed him out. For a moment, the two old friends just sat there, the sound of plates clattering in the kitchen filling the space between them. "You're serious about this?" Charlie finally said. Tom nodded. "More than you know." Charlie's gaze softened, but his voice carried a warning. "Then be ready to live with whatever comes through that door. Or doesn't." They finished their coffee in silence. Outside, the afternoon light had turned thin and metallic, as if the sun itself was holding back. Tom slid into his truck, the napkin with the scrawled number tucked into his coat pocket. The engine coughed before catching, the vibration buzzing through the steering wheel. As he pulled away, the diner's neon sign flickered once, its glow briefly dimming before steadying again. He didn't know if the stranger would call, or if the number would even work. But somewhere under the unease, there was the faint spark of possibility, just enough to keep him from turning back. The call came just after dawn, when the frost was still clinging to the tips of the grass outside his bedroom window. Tom was halfway through lacing his boots for work, when the phone's ring sliced through the quiet. A voice he didn't recognize spoke quickly, as if afraid the line might cut out. "Your man's flying back to Memphis next week, 2 nights in town before he leaves again. That's all you get." Before Tom could ask anything more, the connection went dead. He sat there for a moment, phone still in his hand, heart thudding against his ribs. 2 days in the city. That was it. No guarantees, no details, no second chances. He told his boss he'd be taking time off. Didn't wait for permission. The old truck was topped up with gas, and by the time he rolled out onto the road, the winter sky was a pale wash of blue, the sun weak behind a veil of high clouds. For the first 100 miles, everything held steady. The hum of the tires and the rhythm of the mile markers gave him room to think about what he'd say, how he'd convince a man with a fortress of handlers to look a sick child in the eye. Then, somewhere past Jackson, the truck began to shudder. It started as a faint tremor under his seat, then a violent rattle that made the steering wheel twitch in his hands. He pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, the air outside biting at his ears. Steam hissed from under the hood. When he lifted it, the sharp smell of burnt oil hit him, and a dark smear ran down the side of the engine block. He stood there for a moment, breath puffing out in clouds, before he heard the low growl of a diesel engine coming from behind. A red Kenworth slowed, brakes sighing, and came to a stop just ahead of him. The driver's door opened, and a man in a flannel shirt and a battered cap leaned out. "Need a lift?" Tom hesitated, but only for a second. "Headed toward Memphis," he said. "Climb in. Got room, long as you don't mind a little company." Inside the cab, the air was warm and smelled faintly of coffee and cigarette ash. A thermos sat between the seats, and on the dash, a small photograph of Elvis in '69, white jumpsuit, guitar slung low, was tucked behind the CB radio. "You a fan?" Tom asked. The driver grinned. "Aren't we all? Saw him once in '72. Never forgot it." By the time they crossed into Shelby County, night had already settled over the fields, the horizon a smudge of orange giving way to black. The truck's headlights swept across the tall iron gates of Graceland, and Tom caught his first glimpse of the place, a long, quiet stretch of wall topped with curling notes painted across its surface. The driver pulled over across the street. "This is as far as I go, friend. Rest's on you." Tom thanked him and stepped down onto the cold pavement. The truck roared away, leaving only the faint rumble of the engine fading into the distance. Across the road, the gates loomed, silver and still. A handful of fans were gathered nearby, some clutching cameras, others with hands buried deep in their coat pockets. He walked over, nodding to a woman wrapped in a plaid blanket. "Think they'll let anyone in?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not tonight. Not ever. Unless you're expected." Still, he stayed. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke drifting from somewhere beyond the walls. Now and then a car would pass, tires whispering on the asphalt, but mostly there was just the hush of a winter night settling in. Tom found a spot near the brick pillar by the gate, leaning against it as he pulled a folded photograph from his pocket. Annie, smiling in the backyard last spring, hair caught mid-flight in the breeze. He stared at it, the corners worn soft from handling. "You hang on," he murmured, his voice barely carrying past his own breath. Hours slid by, the cold creeping deeper into his coat. Somewhere around midnight, the last of the other fans drifted off, their footsteps crunching down the sidewalk. Tom stayed, shifting his weight from one foot to the other to keep the blood moving. By 3 a.m, the street was empty, the windows of the house beyond the gates dark. His fingers were stiff, his jaw aching from clenching against the chill. But he kept his place, eyes fixed on the gates as though willing them to open. Somewhere inside, he knew, lights would flick on come morning. People would start their day. And maybe, just maybe, someone would see him before the opportunity slipped away entirely. The first trace of daylight came pale and reluctant, filtering through the bare branches along the street. Tom's toes felt like they'd been carved from stone, his breath coming out in slow white streams. Somewhere inside the mansion grounds, a bird called once, sharp in the cold air, as if to announce that the night was officially over. He straightened his back, trying to rub some life into his shoulders. Across the gate, beyond the frost-coated lawn, the house stood still, shutters drawn, curtains pulled tight. A motion caught his eye. A figure in a dark jacket stepping out from a side building near the gate. The man moved with the purposeful slowness of someone used to standing watch. Tom took the photograph from his pocket and tucked it carefully inside a plain white envelope, along with the folded sheet of paper he'd been carrying since Nashville. His handwriting filled the page, brief, direct, and stripped of anything that might look like a stunt. He just told the truth. His daughter's name, her age, her condition, her wish. When the guard drew close enough to hear him over the crunch of gravel under his boots, Tom spoke. "Sir, could you pass this along to Mr. Presley?" The man's expression didn't change. He kept his eyes on the street, his breath misting in the cold. After a pause, he answered, his voice flat. "I can't take that. Orders are clear. Everything for Mr. Presley goes through the colonel." Tom tightened his grip on the envelope. "I'm not asking for much, just that it reaches him." The guard shook his head once, firmly. "You hand me that. I could lose my job. You don't want me to do that." The refusal landed like a stone in Tom's stomach. He stepped back, the envelope still clutched in his fingers, and turned toward the sidewalk. The quiet was so complete, he could hear the faint squeal of the gate hinges shifting in the cold. That's when he noticed her. A young woman in a long wool coat, her dark hair pulled back, arms full of brown paper grocery bags, was making her way along the inside of the fence toward the service entrance. She glanced over, slowed, then stepped toward the gate. "You waiting for someone?" she asked, her voice low enough to avoid carrying to the guard. Tom hesitated, then held up the envelope. "For Elvis. My daughter's sick. I can't promise anything," the woman cut in quickly, eyes flicking toward the guard, who was now busy lighting a cigarette near the post. She set one of the grocery bags down on the path, freed a hand, and reached through the narrow gap in the gate's bars. "Give it here." Tom slid the envelope into her grasp. Her fingers were cold against his for the briefest moment, before she tucked it deep into her coat pocket. "I'll try," she said, and without another word, she picked up her bag and walked toward the house. He stood there long after she disappeared inside, scanning the windows as if expecting one to swing open in acknowledgement. Nothing moved. No signal came. By the time the streetlights blinked off, Tom's hope felt thin and stretched. Still, there was a difference now. The envelope was no longer in his hand. It was somewhere inside those walls. Whether it would travel any further, he couldn't say. Back in his truck, after coaxing it to life with a stubborn groan from the engine, he turned the heater on full blast and let the warm air sting his cheeks. The road out of Memphis stretched ahead, the skyline slowly receding in the rearview mirror. Halfway to the highway, he caught himself touching his coat pocket, the space where the letter had been. Empty now, out of his hands entirely. The miles rolled by under a sky that had turned the color of wet slate. The thought he couldn't shake was that he might never hear from that woman again, and if nothing happened, he'd be right back where he started, except colder, tireder, and with less time than before. Still, the picture of her slipping the envelope into her coat played again and again in his mind, an image he clung to like a faint ember against the winter chill. The days slid past like a string of muted photographs, gray mornings, pale afternoons, and nights that arrived before he was ready. Tom kept the house warm for Annie, feeding the small wood stove until the metal sides glowed faintly in the dim light. Still, she spent more time curled under blankets, her face pressed into the pillow, than she did sitting up. He'd placed the phone on the kitchen table where he could see it from anywhere in the room. Every time it rang, usually wrong numbers or his boss checking when he'd be back, his chest tightened, and then came the letdown. On the fourth morning, her breathing sounded heavier, like it took more effort to pull air in. The local doctor visited and spoke quietly in the hallway, hat in his hands. "It's moving faster than I'd like. She needs proper care in the city." That afternoon, Tom packed her things in an old canvas bag. They drove to Memphis with the heater groaning in the dashboard, the roads lined with bare trees leaning under the weight of a recent frost. The hospital loomed like a brick sentinel at the edge of town, its windows reflecting the thin winter light. Her new room smelled faintly of disinfectant and boiled linen. From the bed, Annie could see only the parking lot below and a strip of sky. She tried to smile when he settled her in, but it barely touched her eyes. The phone back home was no longer an option. Now Tom checked the payphone at the end of the hospital corridor between visits from the nurses. Each time he lifted the receiver, the cold metal pressed against his ear felt heavier. Always silence on the other end after he dialed his own number to check messages. On the 6th day without word, a man appeared in the doorway to Annie's room. He wore a tan overcoat and carried a small notepad tucked under his arm. "Mr. Walker?" he asked, his voice careful. Tom rose from the chair beside the bed. "That's me. I'm James Lyle, reporter for the Memphis Press. A nurse here told me about your daughter and about Elvis." Tom's shoulders stiffened. "We're not looking for publicity." Lyle nodded slowly. "I get that. But sometimes the fastest way to someone like him is to make sure the whole city knows the story. You've got nothing to lose, and you might just get his attention." Tom glanced at Annie. She was pretending to read a magazine, her small hands fidgeting with the corner of the page. The thought of her face on the front of a paper made his stomach tighten. It could look like a stunt. Worse, it could make him seem like a man trying to shame Presley into coming. But every day that passed was one less chance. "All right," he said finally, "but it's not a circus, just the truth." Lyle promised as much. The next afternoon, they met in the hospital's small visitors' lounge. The reporter asked careful questions, his pen scratching across the paper in quick strokes. He took a single photograph. Annie propped up in bed, the Elvis poster from her room pinned to the wall behind her. When it was done, Tom walked him to the elevator. Lyle offered a firm handshake. "Sunday's edition," he said. "Front page." That night, Tom sat by Annie's bed, the steady beep of the monitor the only sound between them. Outside, the street lamps burned pale halos in the fog, and the thought kept circling in his mind. A letter was one thing. A public story was another. Once it was out there, he couldn't take it back. But as he looked at her, color drained from her cheeks, lashes resting against skin that seemed almost too thin, he knew waiting quietly wasn't enough anymore. If the phone wouldn't ring on its own, maybe the whole city would have to knock for him. The Sunday paper landed with a dull thump against the hospital's front desk, the kind of sound no one notices most days. But this morning, a nurse brought a copy straight to Tom before breakfast trays even rattled down the hall. There she was, Annie, on the front page, black and white, hair brushed neatly over her shoulder, a small smile tugging one corner of her mouth. Behind her, taped to the sterile wall, was the familiar Elvis poster. The headline stretched across the top. "Memphis Girl's Christmas Wish, to see the King one last time." Tom sat in the chair by her bed and unfolded the paper slowly, smoothing the crease. Annie reached for it with both hands, eyes scanning the picture first, before she looked at the words. Her face flushed a little, though her voice was soft. "That's me." The article told the story simply. Her illness, her love of the music, the promise her father had made. It didn't ask for money, didn't beg for sympathy. It ended with a single line: "Time is short, and the city is listening." By noon, the listening had begun in earnest. A nurse turned up the radio in the corridor. A local station was talking about the story, callers phoning in to share memories of their own first Elvis record. At the front desk, flowers began to arrive, some with cards from strangers wishing Annie strength, others from local fan clubs promising to do what they could. Letters followed, some hand-delivered by people who'd never set foot in the hospital before. One was from a woman who'd worked a ticket booth at an Elvis concert in '71. "If anyone can make this happen, it's this city," she wrote in looping cursive. The biggest ripple came in the form of a long black Cadillac pulling into the hospital's circular drive late that afternoon. Heads turned in the lobby. The engine idled for a moment before the rear door swung open. Out stepped a heavy-set man in a crisp suit and an immaculate overcoat, his face set in the practiced half-smile of someone used to being recognized. Tom recognized him instantly. Colonel Tom Parker. He strode to the front desk, leaning in to speak with the receptionist before being directed toward the elevators. When he reached Annie's floor, the hallway seemed to shrink around him. Nurses moved aside. Tom stepped forward, unsure whether to offer his hand or brace himself. "Mr. Walker?" The colonel's voice was smooth, carrying an authority that filled the space. "Yes. I've seen the paper." His eyes flicked briefly toward the open door of Annie's room, then back to Tom. "Mr. Presley is on a demanding schedule. We can't disrupt that, not even for special requests. I'm sure you understand." Tom's jaw tightened. "I understand my daughter doesn't have months. She barely has weeks." The colonel's smile didn't falter, but it lost any warmth. "Mr. Presley's life is managed for a reason. If we opened the door for every story—" "She's not every story," Tom cut in, his voice sharper than he intended. A beat of silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant squeak of a gurney wheel. The colonel finally gave a small shake of his head. "I'll extend your regards to Mr. Presley," he said, his tone making it clear that was all he intended to do. Then he turned, his polished shoes clicking against the tile, and left as suddenly as he'd arrived. Tom stood in the hall, the echo of those footsteps fading into the hum of the building. When he stepped back into Annie's room, she looked at him with questioning eyes. He didn't have the heart to tell her what had just happened. Instead, he excused himself to the far end of the corridor. There, out of sight, the frustration broke loose. His fist slammed against the plaster wall, leaving a faint indentation and a dull ache in his knuckles. The nurses said nothing. One quietly bent down to retrieve a photograph of Annie that had fallen from the bulletin board outside her room. She dusted it off, straightened it, and pinned it back up. For the rest of the evening, Tom kept watch by the bed, the paper folded neatly beside him, its headline still shouting a hope that felt, in that moment, farther away than ever. 2 days slipped past after the colonel's visit, each one draining a little more color from the room. The flowers on the windowsill had begun to bow their heads, petals loosening, the scent turning faintly sweet and stale. Annie slept longer now, her voice quiet when she spoke at all. The doctors moved softly around her, their conversations held just out of earshot. Late on the second night, one of them stopped Tom in the hallway. "We'll make arrangements for you to stay here," the man said gently. "She shouldn't be alone at night anymore." Tom nodded. He didn't need the explanation. They brought him a narrow cot and set it near the foot of her bed. He sat there long after she'd fallen asleep, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest beneath the blankets. Now and then she murmured something he couldn't make out, a ghost of a melody weaving through her breathing, words too soft to catch, but the tune was unmistakable. "Love me tender." The room was dim, lit only by the low amber glow of the wall lamp above the headboard. The city outside seemed far away, its noise softened to a distant hush. Near midnight, the quiet fractured. A pop from somewhere in the walls, followed by the sudden unnatural darkness as every light blinked out. The monitor beside Annie's bed gave a brief alarm before its backup power steadied the display. Down the corridor, voices rose, nurses calling to each other, the squeak of shoes on tile. Someone mentioned a transformer problem. Others spoke of the emergency crew being called. Tom stayed by the bed, one hand resting lightly over Annie's. A nurse brought in a candle, setting it on the table where its flame threw long, wavering shadows against the wall. The scent of melted wax began to blend with the lingering smell of antiseptic. In the flickering light, the room felt smaller, almost close enough to fold into itself. Annie stirred once, opening her eyes just enough to see him. "Is it morning?" she whispered. "Not yet," he murmured. "Go back to sleep." She closed her eyes again, a faint smile playing at the corner of her lips before she drifted away. He didn't know it, but somewhere across town, another light had been switched on, this one inside a quiet room at Graceland. A kitchen employee, the same young woman who had taken his envelope days earlier, was showing it to a man in a simple black shirt. His hair was slicked back, his expression unreadable as he read the letter once, then again, more slowly. While the hospital's corridors moved under the dim glow of candles and battery lamps, the preparations had begun without a word reaching Tom. Conversations were kept low, phone calls made from private lines, instructions whispered to people who had worked in the mansion for years. Back in the ward, Tom leaned back in the chair, exhaustion pulling at his shoulders. The steady sound of Annie's breathing was the only rhythm in the room. The candle's flame swayed gently each time the door opened for a nurse to check in, then settled again when the door clicked shut. He thought of the colonel's polished shoes vanishing down the hallway, of the silence that had followed, and told himself this was the end of it. Still, a stubborn corner of his mind refused to let go. It whispered that a promise like his wasn't meant to die quietly. Outside, the wind pressed against the building, carrying the scent of distant rain. Somewhere far beyond those walls, a plan was moving toward him. Slow, careful, and unseen. For now, though, all he could do was sit in the half-dark, listening to the faint, familiar hum of hope he didn't yet realize was already on its way. By morning, the electricity was back. The overhead lights buzzed faintly as they warmed to life, and the machines in the ward returned to their steady electronic hum. Annie slept through most of it, her head turned toward the wall, hair spilling across the pillow in loose strands. The hospital felt different that day. Not busier, exactly, but more deliberate. Footsteps in the hall were slower, conversations shorter, glances more frequent in Tom's direction. When a nurse came in with fresh linens, she seemed distracted, folding them with mechanical precision, while her eyes kept drifting toward the door. Near midday, the attending physician appeared, wearing an expression Tom couldn't read. "I need to speak with you about some lab results," he said. His tone was even, but his hand tightened briefly on the chart he was carrying. Tom glanced at Annie, still asleep, then followed him into the corridor. They walked toward the far end of the hall, the doctor murmuring something about adjustments to medication. The words barely registered. Tom kept thinking about how deliberately the man had pulled him away from the room. When they returned a few minutes later, the door to Annie's room was closed. A nurse stood in front of it, holding a clipboard, her eyes on the floor. "What's going on?" Tom asked. She hesitated, then said, "You'll need to wait here for a moment." From behind the door came muffled voices, one higher than the rest, light, almost playful. Then a deeper tone joined in, warm and measured. The sound stirred something in Tom's memory, but the wall between them swallowed the words before he could be sure. He stepped closer, but the nurse shifted slightly, blocking his way without seeming confrontational. "Just a few more minutes," she said. The corridor seemed longer than usual, stretching away in both directions, every movement amplified. A cart rattled past, its metal wheels squealing against the tile. Somewhere, a phone rang twice and stopped. The air carried the faint scent of fresh flowers, stronger than it had been that morning, as if someone had just brought in a bouquet. Tom's hand found the cool metal of the door handle. He held it without turning, the faint vibration of voices on the other side running through his palm. Every instinct urged him to push in, to see who had stepped into that room without him. But something in the nurse's posture, a mix of restraint and quiet reassurance, kept him still. Minutes bled into each other. The laughter inside came again, softer now, followed by a silence so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. The door stayed closed. Tom shifted his weight, the tension in his shoulders making the muscles in his neck ache. The scent of the flowers drifted past again, mingling with the antiseptic tang in the air. He thought of Annie's small voice singing in the dark 2 nights ago, the way her fingers had curled loosely around his, and the promise he'd made in their kitchen weeks earlier. Now, with the sound of that unknown voice on the other side of the wall, the possibility hung in front of him, close enough to taste, but sealed away behind a simple panel of painted wood. He didn't know if it was a gift being prepared for her or another cruel delay. All he knew was that whatever waited inside that room, it was moving toward its end. The handle under his fingers stayed cold. The voices inside shifted to murmurs. And then, nothing. The latch clicked. It was a small sound, but in the stillness of that hallway, it struck like a drumbeat. The door opened just enough for light from the window inside to spill across the floor at Tom's feet. A figure stepped into view. No stage lights, no rhinestones, no orchestra behind him, just a man in a plain black shirt, sleeves neatly rolled, and dark trousers that carried the faint crease of careful hands. His hair was combed back, but loose enough to soften the line of his face. In one hand, he held a worn guitar, the strap draped casually over his shoulder. He looked at Tom first, meeting his eyes with an expression that seemed to take in the months of strain, the sleepless nights, the unspoken weight. "She's your little girl." His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but there was something in it, an undercurrent that pressed deeper than the words themselves. Tom nodded, unable to find an answer that didn't feel too small for the moment. "You've done right by her," the man said. "Takes a strong one to carry this far." Without waiting for a reply, he stepped past Tom into the room. Annie was sitting up, a quilt pulled high around her shoulders, her eyes wide. For a second, she didn't seem to believe what she was seeing. Then her hand crept out from the folds of the blanket, fingers trembling. He smiled, not the kind meant for a crowd, but the one reserved for someone's kitchen table or a porch at dusk. Pulling a chair close to the bed, he eased down and shifted the guitar into his lap. The first notes came gentle, unhurried, as though each one had been weighed before it left the strings. His voice followed, low, warm, carrying the tune Annie had hummed in the dark only nights before. "Love me tender, love me sweet." She leaned forward slightly, the smile settling into her features, and mouthed the words along with him. The room seemed to fold inward, everything outside the 4 walls falling away until there was only the music, the slow tap of his boot on the linoleum, and the faint click of a pick against steel strings. When the last chord faded, he reached into his shirt pocket and drew out a small chain. At the end of it hung a heart-shaped pendant, the surface worn smooth in places. He set it gently on the blanket between them. "For you," he said. "So you know I kept my word." Annie closed her fingers around it, her eyes never leaving his. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. He touched the back of her hand lightly, then rose. There was no rush, no awkwardness, only the sense of someone closing a circle they'd been meant to draw all along. At the door, he paused. Tom stood there, still silent, unsure if he should speak, or simply let the moment pass untouched. The man gave a single nod, a faint tilt of the head, then stepped into the hallway. Tom turned just in time to see him walking down the corridor, hands in his pockets now, guitar strap over one shoulder. The overhead lights caught in his hair, throwing brief glints as he moved away. No entourage, no cameras, just the soft rhythm of his footsteps against the tile until they disappeared around the corner. Back inside, the air still carried the faint trace of his cologne, something clean and sharp with a warmth beneath it. Annie sat with the pendant in her palm, turning it slowly as though memorizing every line. The sun was lowering outside, slanting its last light through the window, catching the curve of the guitar case now leaning against the far wall. For the first time in weeks, Tom let himself breathe without the tightness in his chest. Some promises, he thought, aren't meant for breaking.